I'll start off maybe with a brief introduction around who are the ACO and the TSA, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speakers tonight, this building, and then we'll get started. There'll be a Q&A after the presentation, so please keep in mind any questions that you have as you watch the evening's presentation, and we'll give you lots of time to ask those questions. So both the ACO and the TSA are volunteer-led organizations working here in Toronto to advocate, educate, and inform the public around issues of architectural conservancy, preservation, which is the ACO's particular mandate, and architectural dialogue, urban influences and intensification, and any other aspects of architecture in the city, which is the TSA's mandate. So we are both organizations that rely heavily on membership for the funding of this kind of programming. And we are both organizations that are open to anyone. So if you have a passion for old buildings and preservation and heritage, if you have a passion for architecture and urban issues, please consider becoming a member of both the ACO and the TSA, which allows us to do these kinds of things, to rent these kinds of spaces, and to provide this kind of dialogue for you and with you. So please consider that, and there are websites to read more about both of these organizations. Tonight's lecture is a joint presentation, as I mentioned, and we are sponsored tonight by LRI, who are life safety consultants who have been generously supporting the TSA's urban affairs forums for the last number of years. So we really appreciate their ongoing support for this and other lectures within the TSA's annual schedule. So a little bit about where we are. We are in the Heliconian Hall here in Yorkville in Toronto. This hall, home of the Heliconian Club since 1923, was built in the Carpenter Gothic Revival style in 1876. Established in 1909, the Heliconian Club brought together professional women from an eclectic mix of artistic disciplines, including music, art, dance, drama, and literature, offering a much-needed space or venue where they could be free to express, to share, and develop their talents at a time when men dominated the arts. The Heliconian Hall continues this mission today and has served as an important center for artistic creativity, promoting the place of women in the arts in Canada, and the building itself was designated as a National Historic Site in 2008. So I'm particularly pleased to be here with you and welcome you all to this site. And please check out the Heliconian Hall website as well for the ongoing programming around the arts that they are producing on a daily, weekly, and annual basis. So this evening we have two feature speakers plus a really interesting and special introduction by Ji Chung from the ACO. So Ji, you'll hear from first. She's an executive member of the ACO Toronto, and she has a short story to tell about the land that we're on and the territory that we're in here in Yorkville in Toronto. Following Ji, we have Nicole Hansen, who will speak to us about tonight's topic. She's an environmental urban planner with experience in the provincial, municipal, private, and nonprofit sectors. And within the planning profession, she has been recognized particularly for her leadership in addressing cemetery urbanism as a contemporary planning issue, both within Canada and in the United States. Her work on spatially planning for death in cities has been included or working with the ministry in the Cemeteries and Crematoriums Regulation Unit, reviewing complex development applications and ensuring regulatory environmental compliance for all cemeteries in Ontario. She has contributed to the 2015-2041 York Regional Official Plan regarding cemetery needs analysis and the City of Mississauga Cemetery Feasibility Study, and continues to facilitate this kind of planning policy and landscape architectural conversations around cemeteries and the growing obligations to the silent city. After Nicole, we're going to hear from Adam Bunch. Adam is the author of the Toronto Book of the Dead, the creator of the Toronto Dreams Project, and the host of the Canadiana web series. He's written about the history of the city for Spacing Magazine, the Torontoist, and Huffington Post, among other things, as well as his own Toronto Dreams Project historical ephemera blog. In 2012, his work earned an honorable mention for a Governor General's History Award. And as I said, after both Adam and Nicole speak, we'll have time for questions and answers. So I'd like to first welcome G to the stage to tell us a little bit about the territory that we're on. Thank you.
Good evening. For thousands of years, Indigenous people inhabited this area, now known as the ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and in particular, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, whose territory we are gathering on today. Nearby at Philosopher's Walk, you will see visible remains of a ravine and high banks along the wall. That was Taddle Creek. This spot was a significant springtime gathering place for Indigenous people who used the creek for food, water, and transportation. A muddy forest trail carved out by Indigenous people became known as Yonge Street when in 1793 John Graves Simcoe ordered a road be built to replace the trails that led north to Lake Simcoe. 20 years ago, my high school-aged daughter had a part-time job at Sunrise Records, located at 784 Yonge Street. Her first basement washroom break was also her last. On exiting the washroom, she found the basement plunged into darkness and felt a menacing presence. Other employees reported the same hair-raising experiences. Many years later, Marjorie Stewart, a cemeteries expert with the Ontario Historical Society, alluded to a cemetery on Yonge Street, south of Bloor, but provided no additional details. My curiosity was piqued when I learned 784 Yonge Street was included in the Stollery redevelopment. The menswear store was opened in 1901 on the southwest corner of Yonge and Bloor. A Google search popped up, why is Sunrise Records 784 Yonge Street of historical significance? And where exactly are Toronto's ancient Indian burial grounds? Now, thoroughly intrigued, a visit to the Yorkville Library produced very startling results. My findings and confirmation by a York University professor of Indigenous Studies revealed the site was once an ancient Indigenous burial ground known as Sandhill. Historian Henry Scadding, in his work Toronto of Old, published in 1873, noted the burial site was intact some 60 years after the War of 1812, when the site was dug up and loads of soil containing the bones of the Indian brave killed in 1812 and his forefathers have been carried away in the removal process and used as mortar for buildings in the area. Well, that was quite shocking. Rick Hall, a Six Nations educator, said our connection to the soil is profound and unmolested graves are necessary for strong spiritual bonds to remain intact over generations. First Nations people believe a person is created with two spirits. Upon death, the soul split, one resting with the buried remains and the other returning to the sky world where we believe the Creator lives. We have ceremonies by which the spirits find their resting place. When their remains are on earth, it's like calling the spirits back from a deep sleep, causing great anguish. Then something needs to be done to make that right again. I took my findings to the developer, who immediately agreed to make it right again. And in September 2016, the Mississaugas of the New Credit performed a ceremony on their desecrated site, followed by a traditional feast to calm the suffering spirits. I stood very quietly on the construction site while Elder Gary Sue intoned prayers, and shortly before the ceremony came to a close, I felt a warm tingling sensation enter through the bottom of my feet, move upwards through my body, and out through the top of my head. Was that a sign from the spirits that harmony had been restored? I believe so. The Mississaugas chief Stacey Laforme, an accomplished poet, wrote, In days long ago, this was a place of nature and beauty, a sacred place, a land of medicine, a land where all different nations gathered to heal wounds of body and spirit. My people are but a small part of this land, for many, many nations now call this land home. We share a similar past, a kindred spirit, and a common heritage. We must always remember the real reason that we are here, to do the right thing for our people, the heartbeat that is Toronto. A visioning workshop is taking place to create a commemorative plan for the Stollery founders and will include appropriate recognition of the Mississaugas of the new credit. Sections of the Stollery facade's Art Deco panels will be included in the new development. Plans are underway to narrate the tales of Tattle Creek. Springing from ancient Lake Iroquois, its tributaries winding through Midtown and downtown Toronto, its waters used by Toronto's first industries, other significant historic connections including the Indigenous gathering place and the bearing of Tattle Creek into underground sewers. A sizable heritage plaque is anticipated for placement in the Bloor and Queen's Park Cultural Precinct. So that is the end of my little tale. Thank you.
Good evening. Is that better? More fitting? All right. Thank you for having me today. My name is Nicole Hansen. And I'm just going to be having a conversation with you this evening about the cemetery. We're going to puncture the reading of that space today, and we're going to see what the cemetery has to offer in terms of a conversation with politics, death, the political economy of death, architecture, urbanization, intensification, and we're going to just kind of brew the pot here tonight, just have a informal conversation. So I'm going to skip that part because that part's already done. Okay. So the silent city, urban taboo. Henry Lefebvre's argument in The Production of Space is that space is a social product or a complex social construction based on values and the social production of meanings, which affects the spatial practices and perceptions. So what are some of the perceptions that you have when it comes to the urban cemetery? Whether you're walking on the street and it's unfenced and you're kind of standing there waiting for the bus, or you notice that you can't see it at night because there's so many trees covering it or hanging around the borders of the streetscape. How does that make you feel? And what has been your interaction with the urban cemetery? I'd really like to know. Exactly. It's tabooed. Nobody wants to deal with it. Death is not an easy thing to talk about. We all have a pending appointment with the cemetery, whether we're going to be looking at in-ground burial or whether we're looking at cremation. The cremation rate is about 54% in Ontario, and so it's increasing, but what's interesting to know is that when you are cremated, you usually do end up back in a cemetery over time just as a resting place, so land consumption is happening with regards to your remains. So the cemetery, again, is heavily tabooed, and it's important to unpack what we look at in terms of its spatial arrangement so we can really understand it as a space that's necessary for the city to thrive. So the silent city, rendered as invisible, planning omits cemetery planning. So going through some research a few years ago, I did realize that planners weren't planning for cemeteries, and we weren't really having that conversation with regards to urbanism. Cities are becoming more dense, more intensified. We have affordable housing issues, we have transit equity issues. But with regards to places to die, why is that not a part of the conversation? We plan for places to live, to work, to play, but no one really has an idea of where they're going to be buried or where their loved one's going to be interred. And what's interesting about cemeteries is that it's the only type of land you can use once and use forever. You can't rezone a cemetery. Once it's there forever. And so it's really important for us to talk about land uses that are only going to be used once and forever. So pioneering cemeteries. Mount Pleasant group of cemeteries was established in the early 19th century when Toronto was a small Victorian capital known as the town of York. Back then, only Anglicans and Roman Catholics could be buried in an authorized cemetery. Everyone else had to be buried outside of the city. Then in 1826, the first cemetery was a potter's field, and it was opened with the mission to accommodate all Toronto families, regardless of religion. And that's kind of the history of Mount Pleasant, and I'm going to use Mount Pleasant tonight as a focal point only because it's a cemetery that most people are very familiar with. It's heavily used for passive recreation, having long walks, a space of preservation, a space where they have a rich arboretum, there's lots of bird watching, and it's a space where people are engaging with the cemetery, but in passing. So it does provide green space in the city, and it continues to tell stories and change over time just based on its spatial arrangement. Today, Mount Pleasant obviously is well over 200 acres, and within it, it has elements of the Garden City. It has elements of the rolling hills and the pastoral landscape. They have cultural enclaves and boulder gardens. And you'll find different types of architectural features in there with regards to the headstones and how they're erected and where they're erected. I'll get into a little bit more about that later, but just wanted to bring that to your attention. Bathurst Law Memorial Park is also a well-known Toronto cemetery. It has multiple cemeteries within it. So there's one cemetery operator, but within it they actually have well over 50 to 75 different cemeteries based on the synagogues. So with regards to Bathurst Memorial, I just wanted to share a few notes about Jewish cemeteries. Their architectural style is focused on the Renaissance, a renaissance of traditional Jewish elements and design, which first dated back to the 20th century when the German cemetery reform movement became influential in Jewish burial practices. So most of their tombstones are in Hebrew, and in-ground burial is required. So there is that argument where, why do we need to bury people? It's a waste of land, it's a waste of space. Actually, death is an equity issue. And it's an equity issue because not everyone has access to premium land in Toronto, but more importantly, not everybody can compromise religious and cultural values as they move through the cemetery as an urban rites of passage to die. So that's something that's important to note. So kind of going back to Mount Pleasant, and I kind of just wanted to do a bit of a shift. Mount Pleasant does accept, they're non-denominational, they're the largest non-for-profit operating cemetery group in Ontario, and they do have cultural landscapes for a variety of cultural and religious values. So whether you're Muslim or if you're Jewish or if you're Christian, you're Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, if you're a Buddhist, if you practice feng shui, they carry a lot of variety in their cemeteries, and their cemetery landscapes are changing very much so. You can see within their landscape they have ancient Roman elements of architecture, Baroque, Egyptian Revival, Renaissance, Neoclassical, Beaux Arts, Gothic Revival, just to name a few. And so what's interesting about cemeteries is that the stones are based on lots and plots. So zoning actually first happened in the cemetery. When a cemetery decides to develop, they do that through a bylaw. The cemetery decides how large the plots are and how wide they are. They also decide the capacity, how many units. That's okay. And I'll try and talk in a spatial language with regards to planning and architecture just so I can capture this from a regulatory standpoint in there. And so when you have a large stone like this, most likely you have, it's called a plot, so you have at least 5 or 6 people that are buried all together. When you have the smaller stones, they're usually singles, so it's one dwelling unit, for example. So you have one person in there. So as we're in the midst of dealing with affordable housing and a shrinking middle class based on Holchansky's report, people don't have access to live, but also they don't have access to die. Cemeteries are actually an affordable housing issue. It's a perpetual affordable housing issue. And it's really important to note that, because while some people have a religious need to be buried or interned, they might not be able to because the land value is so high. So now a lot of cemeteries are now changing their bylaws to allow for an increased capacity with each lot. So you have a lot of people who are jumping in with grandma and grandpa and uncle because they can't afford to buy land. So that tells you a lot about how the city of the living mirrors the city of the dead with regard to the social production of space, and how that will also inform the architectural landscape of death and what we see. So here's Mount Pleasant now again. They've been evolving continuously using a scattering garden. This is called a scattering garden. So basically this is for cremated remains. So when you're cremated, if you don't want to be in a columbarium, the little squares that kind of look like a mailbox, you can be sprinkled in a body of water. You can also be sprinkled on crown land by law. You don't need to be in a cemetery, a licensed cemetery. But this has become a common practice and something that's much more affordable. And you'll see a lot more of that within the silent city. So this is important to note because as the cost of living gets higher and there's inflation and there's affordable housing issues, we're dealing with all these urban issues. The exact same thing is happening in the cemetery. People are deciding to compromise culture at times to find a place, a resting place, and sometimes it's not that desirable, sometimes it is, but these are the push and pull factors within the political economy of death that really inform the landscape and the social production of space. And that social production of space is what I call memoryscapes. Memoryscapes are located within deathscapes, and those memoryscapes basically are the performance, the architectural performance of how you get remembered and how your story gets told and retold throughout time. Modern versus postmodern. So, modern, I've worked as a funeral celebrant to help families on social assistance who have a service or something small. So I've been on site to a variety of different cemeteries outside of my planning hat to actually see how the space functions and how people actually, what options people have at the time of death or at the time of need is what we say. And traditional burial does happen for a lot of, again, traditional cultures, like if you're traditional Orthodox or if you're traditional Muslim or if you're a traditional Catholic, right? And a full body burial is something that is usually required. And so there's always signs for new lots being available, and it's like basically kind of like new condo units being available, right? So these are at a premium, and they usually go for well over $7,000, $10,000, $15,000, depending on where you're located within the cemetery. So think about that. There's cultural communities and enclaves, kind of like when you're driving through different parts of Toronto, you know, Forest Hill, there's different areas, you know, and you can kind of see the neighborhoods. It's exactly the same in the cemetery. So they plan for diverse internment needs, and it's important to just kind of be aware of that. But there's an issue with that, and I think we'll get into that. So a few years ago, I decided to lead a deputation at the City of Toronto to advocate for more cemetery space to be considered in official and secondary plans, and how zoning can be used to kind of free up some of the existing open space, and also how cemeteries that are currently being operated by the City of Toronto can be reactive. So what that means is if a cemetery is inactive, it means that it's currently not taking any burials, and it's not honoring any outstanding burials in anyone's family. So Toronto operates quite a handful of cemeteries. Parks and Recs is in the cemetery operating business. They don't like to say that, but they do. All those memorial benches that you see, those memorial trees, those are modern-day cemeteries. So, based on cemetery development, thinking about it from a modern perspective, there's really no point doing it because they're sprawling. Where are you going to get 100 acres in Toronto? And the capital investment alone is $100 million. Adding development costs is another $190K per acre. And the upfront capital required before revenue stream is $119 million. If cemeteries don't break even, they become the municipality's burden. That means your taxes will skyrocket. So it's in the city of Toronto or any municipality's best favor to help the small churches and the volunteer boards that are running their cemeteries and the nonprofit organizations to help them free up land and to help them actually open up more capacity when they want to put in a development application to expand or also increase the capacity of the cemetery. A lot of that is there's NIMBYism. There's no, we don't want a cemetery or a crematorium in my backyard. It's the shadow of death, you know. There's a lot of taboo associated to it. However, how will the city function if we don't even have considerations of what the new cemetery could look like, right, in our new urban environments? So, basic cemetery economics and the political economy of death. 800 casket burials can fit per acre. 3,000 mausoleum crypts per acre. 10,000 cremation burials per acre. And with the GTA being projected to grow well over, I think it's between 5.8 to 7.45 million by 2031. Where's everyone going to go? Where are we going to go? Right? So having a modern cemetery, the beautiful Rolling Hill Pastoral Cemetery, does not fit the bill moving forward to accommodate mortality rates, population projections, finite lands, and cultural needs of death in the city. Postmodern density. So cemetery planning intersects with planning for transportation and affordable housing and creating complete communities. It's important to note that as we continue to intensify and grow up, there's things happening, like condofication. We're intensifying, we're no longer sprawling out, we're building up to accommodate for whether it's retail space, residential space. The cemetery is doing the same thing. We now have mausoleums that were only 2 to 3 stories, beautiful neoclassical mausoleums or Gothic revival. And, they're now getting higher and higher to house more people. And so you move from a mausoleum that would usually be 1 or 2 stories that is skyrocketing to about 6 to 8 to 10 stories, right? We have infill. Everyone knows about infill, right? We're trying to find more spaces between existing buildings to accommodate housing. The cemetery is doing the exact same thing. The spatial arrangements in there are doing the exact same thing. So a lot of cemetery operators like Parklawn is known to pull up roads that are winding and that lead to other parts of the cemetery that are, some parts are higher. They have maybe single mausoleums that are like basically family estates or little mansions on a hill. And they're tearing up these roads. There's different parts of the cemetery that are for social assistance. There are parts that are unmarked for people who were criminals. There are parts of the cemetery that are just for people who have a family plot, right? And the cemetery is broken up into very different areas. And so you have the operator now pulling up roads, sometimes trees, to accommodate growth. So there's infill happening, but that infill is also causing an equity issue. I was in there one day just kind of walking around, and an old man came up to me, and he asked me, he's like, wasn't there a path here a month ago? Wasn't there a path here? I don't remember how to get to my wife's spot. And it broke my heart because He had no idea how to wayfind and navigate through the silent city. And these are changes that are happening, and they're happening very quickly. And so when we're thinking about density, and we're thinking about accommodating growth, just like neighborhoods are becoming more dense and you have more generational families living together, it's exactly what's happening in the cemetery. And these are important things to note because the spatial arrangements will definitely require a different look and a different feel in order to, with regards to architecture, in an urban area, in order to make more space for the population that's to come. So the Condofication of Mausoleums. I actually reviewed this application back in, I think, 2014. It was for St. Catholic Cemeteries. Markham residents were very upset because the city of Markham approved, under York Region, they had approved a mausoleum subdivision, right? Yeah, a subdivision full of mausoleums. So there was going to be, I think, about 5 to 6 of them, but with regards to their height, the building size actually was to accommodate 100,000 Catholics living in Markham. The region had asked the province to consider removing the requirement that cemeteries be small scale on protected greenlands. So they actually wanted to bury on the greenbelt, and they had approached, the York Region had approached the province. And the term small scale cemetery wasn't really defined, and we were trying to pull out what that actually meant. How many acres can we have? What does the cemetery look like in the greenbelt? Is it natural burial, or what are the design elements going to look like? And there was kind of going around. We're still kind of going around to find out, is it possible to bury on the greenbelt? But in the meantime, Markham approved a design that far surpasses the zoning bylaw. The 4-story mausoleum in a Greco-Roman style will be more than 103 meters long and nearly 24 meters high once finished. So cemeteries are finding a way to urbanize and intensify as much as they can. And within a mausoleum, you have crypts. So where are my Italian folks? Right? So in Italy, there's a high water table. So back home in Italy, bodies were always in crypts because it was above the high water table, and that's been a practice that a lot of the Italians brought over and continue to do. And beautiful marble inside, glass, veneer. It's just they're really impeccable inside. But they're challenging sometimes because of the heating and the cooling, right? And the prices are a bit more. But again, these are desirable spaces, and it's important to note that as the city continues to grow, so does the cemetery, and that's going to be a challenge because we don't have any more space to accommodate. Cemetery urbanism. So this is a term that I've coined just to kind of disrupt and kind of rethink about how we think about cemeteries and their spatial arrangement. This is a African burial ground in Manhattan, New York City. So cemeteries, this cemetery is actually less than 100 acres. It's probably less than 0.15 acres. I consider it to be a cemetery parkette. And these are some of the elements that I would highly recommend and prescribe in thinking about cemeteries. So mixing of uses, and that's a sensitive one because not all cemeteries will be able to mix uses. You can't mix uses regarding a Jewish cemetery. Jewish cemeteries are holy and sacred. There is no passive recreation in a Jewish cemetery. They will chase you out. Okay, there's no bike riding in a Jewish cemetery. It's very respectful, and it's very sacred and holy. And so not all these elements will fit to be ascribed to all cultures and creeds and religious values, but it's just a template, so I just want to make that clear. Passive recreation, Section 37 benefit agreements. You know, I think it's important that Section 37 be in that conversation with regards to allocating cemetery land for any type of residential development going forward. I think it's important to see how it can be used as a community amenity space. A memorial space can be had without even having green space. You know, columbarium parkettes where people can sit. There can be a fountain. There can be bike racks, and it can really be connected to the street and other parts, other transportation nodes. Kind of like there's one that I can show you at the end of the slide, but I think it's important to also consider Section 37 as being a part of that conversation. And there's various architectural forms. So this is the African Burial Ground Monument in Manhattan, and it contains the remains of more than 419 Africans buried in the late 17th and 18th centuries. And it was one of the largest colonial era cemeteries for people of African descent, some free and some enslaved. So this 5 to 6 acre excavation site was actually one of the largest and most important historical urban archaeological projects in the United States. The burial ground is New York's earliest known African American cemetery, and studies show that an estimated 15,000 African American people were actually buried here in Lower Manhattan. So if we're looking at the design elements here, the granite wall is supposed to reflect the middle passage. And so these design elements coming out of the old world and coming into the new world, having that reconciliation was something that they wanted to capture and bring sentimental value to the space. So there's always opportunities to historicize and reconcile spaces in the city that have deep traumatic and deep-rooted histories that are not necessarily talked about, but there's ways to capture that, and there's a beauty in that, capturing that in a perpetual type of meaningful way. Cemetery urbanism. So this is Christchurch St. James Cemetery, which is in Mimico. I love Mimico. Do you guys love Mimico? I'm always down there by the lake. It's so pretty. And I like it because it's kind of like I'm in Buffalo, just kind of stuck in time in Mimico. That's just me. But so cemetery urbanism. So again, this cemetery is less than 0.15 acres, and the GO station kind of abuts it on the other side of the parking lot. It faces a few patio restaurants. It has elements of the Garden City. It's a very human scale, very friendly. It's easy to walk through. It's accessible. There's seating. You know, there's low shrubs and bushes, and it's just easy to kind of see around you and through fences and through trees and kind of around your area. And so these are, again, some of the design elements that might help us think about how we can plan for smaller scale cemeteries in our communities or memorial spaces. How much time do I have? Okay, so this is the Equilato Cemetery in Nunavut. They say it in a very particular way. I think it's called Iqaluit, yeah. And this cemetery celebrates the Arctic while providing the community with a sacred space to bury and commemorate their people. The design process was based on a 2-year collaboration of landscape architects, engineers, municipal leaders and residents, and Inuit leaders whose contribution invested the design with a unique understanding and appreciation of the site. So they used a lot of local materials, artifacts, and iconic symbols of the Inuit, and the cemetery was established as a strong connection between the land and the people it will serve. So what's interesting to note is that the bowhead is actually created by whale bones, and it's a culturally and spiritually significant cemetery feature. It's also preserving a delicate tundra ecosystem. And the cemetery maintenance for the northern climate was also incorporated into the design. So this is more of a naturalized cemetery. And these are also options that we can, for example, look at in thinking about the spatial arrangement of the cemetery and just kind of making sure it's a part of the community fabric as it continues to shape our stories. So, kind of wanted to throw a question out there. Maybe I should wait till the question and answer period, but I can just throw it out. Okay, I'll just throw it out. So how will you contribute to the form and function in the telling of our stories? And we all are able to do that. We all place make, we all negotiate space based on our identity and where we are in our life, and how we consume space is something that we're always doing. And so I was kind of leaving a funeral, and I just kind of wanted to get that shot of the hearse, which, you know, could be daunting. But when you look at it, it's just, when you think about it, that processional to the cemetery is something that's also very important. It's urban memory, and within the memory economy, we actually are socialized to perform, right? And that performance in death is something that is always happening. So from when you leave the funeral, right, your body's on this, you're basically on this, in this type of performance. From when you get to the cemetery, the architectural arrangements of how you get consumed within the land is also on performance and needs to be thought about. So whether a casket is in a vault or it's not in a vault determines what your grave looks like 10 or 20 years from now, because there's a natural gravitational pull towards the south. So once that casket collapses and the earth is sunken and the tombstone turns, these are things that characterize the space and the taboo of what we see. And so it's important to note that form and function are the elements I know that we discuss a lot in planning and architecture. But really, the socialization of those elements also have strong meaning, especially when we're thinking about the cemetery. And I just want to quickly end on, I think we'll do the next one. Yeah, I'll just end on a quick note. So, the silent city, spaces of the dead will always mirror spaces of the living. So this was in Brooklyn, New York. I was at the Greenwood Cemetery, which is one of my favorite cemeteries to be in, and I was high on a hill on top of a crypt, and just kind of looking over into lower Manhattan, over the harbor of the East River, and I just happened to stand behind this beautiful tombstone, and I noticed it was similarly just strikingly mirroring the One World Trade Center, and it just caught me right there that the city of the living will always mirror the city of the dead, just like how there's skyscrapers and just like how there's, you know, low density buildings. It's the same thing with the cemetery, and it's a simple thought, but that simple thought unpacks so many other complex issues about the arrangement of the space and how to preserve history. How do you preserve these stories? How do you preserve these narratives, but also move towards more of a postmodern approach that's more sustainable with regards to land, and in consuming space once and forever, right? So just wanted to let you know a few notes, and then I think I'm pretty much done. Toronto will be out of casket burial space in 10 to 20 years, a short time in a cemetery's planning horizon, which is 115 years. Cemetery planning, it's generational, so we look at 4 generations, and that's how we plan. So even though as planners, for example, we look at the PPS for that 20-year planning horizon, the cemetery's planning needs to supersede that and be more of a visionary in thinking about the landscape beyond 20 years. Approximately 40,000 GTA deaths happen per year, so assume 7.8 deaths per 1,000 population. The city has yet to implement a functional land use of cemeteries in the official and secondary plans, and I think I did note that. And we need a cemetery feasibility study does help with that, looking at mortality rates, population projections, land consumption at need. If for whatever reason there's no room in Toronto and you have to accommodate a burial in Markham or Barrie, there's a tax that you also get for that. And that's why it's important for us to think locally and do locally, because it's not going to be affordable. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to end the note on. So again, there is just one note as well, that the provincial policy statement did have a review back in 2014. And the need to plan for cemeteries was addressed in language, but not in full practice with regards to section 1.1.1b. So it was released, and the ministry actually added the word cemeteries to that policy. And it says, the list of institutional uses that should be considered by planning authorities to better recognize all stages of life, accommodating an appropriate range and mix of residential, including second units, affordable housing and housing for older persons, employment, including industrial and commercial, institutional, including places of worship, cemeteries, and long-term care homes, and it continues and continues. But this has been a missed mark, and municipalities have an opportunity to work on cemetery master plans, work with parks planning, and see what opportunities arise. I think landscape architecture is going to be very innovative in the next few years to see. I'm interested to see where it goes with regards to how we will continue to plan for cemeteries. And if we don't, I think we're the ones that are really sleeping. Thank you.
Okay, so this is Toronto. It's at the end of the 1800s. And this is a photo taken of the oldest neighborhood in our city. The 10 blocks around the St. Lawrence Market were the very first 10 blocks that were planned when the town of York was first founded at the end of the 1700s. And over the next century, that neighborhood turned into this, a dense neighborhood filled with historic buildings. And there's some landmarks in there that you can still find today. That church spire, sort of in the middle of the photo, is St. James Cemetery, which is still the second tallest church spire anywhere in North America. The St. Lawrence Market's in there too, and St. Lawrence Hall. And many gorgeous Victorian buildings, exactly the kind of buildings we love to enjoy today, and that had the potential, I think, to turn this neighborhood into Toronto's answer to Old Montreal or Old Quebec City. Except, of course, that's not what happened. By the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s, this exact same neighborhood had turned into this. Parking. Pretty much just parking. There are a few old buildings that survived the wrecking ball. That's the Flatiron building, sort of in the middle of the photo. You can still see the St. Lawrence Market and St. Lawrence Hall. St. James Cathedral is off to the side, but most of the historic buildings have been replaced with cars. And Toronto had earned a reputation, as I'm sure the people in this room are well aware, of not being especially good at preserving our own history and our own built heritage. And there were lots of reasons for that. One of them was this guy. This angry-looking jerk is named Sir Daniel Wilson. He was the very first head of history at the University of Toronto, and I think the university's first president, too. He's best known because he's the guy who coined the term prehistory. And in Toronto, he considered our city's history to belong to that category. He once gave a speech claiming that Toronto essentially had no history, that it was a blank sheet waiting to be written on. And he gave that speech in the 1880s, nearly a century after the city was founded, after invasions and rebellions and plagues in our streets, after Toronto being turned into an important hub at the end of the Underground Railroad, never mind the thousands of years of indigenous history that came before that. But Wilson, of course, wasn't alone. It's a common feeling in Toronto over the years that our history wasn't important, and there are lots of reasons for that. People cite the colonial mentality that suggested nothing important ever happens in Toronto, happens across the ocean in London, or the Canadian inferiority complex that says that nothing important ever happens in Toronto, it happens across the border in New York. But I think one of the interesting connections or interesting reflections of that is forgetfulness tied to the way we see our dead and have sort of evolved in our thinking over the years. So that's part of what I wanted to talk about tonight and share some stories that I talk about in my Toronto Book of the Dead. So this is what a lot of cemeteries used to look like in Toronto. This one's actually just outside the city in Ancaster. A lot of the city's early settlers in the early 1800s buried their loved ones in small cemeteries, frequently beside the local church, like this one. And that meant that your dead, your ancestors, were part of really your daily life. Every 7 days when you went to church, there they were, waiting outside the church on your way in and on your way out, hard to avoid and forget. And that kind of thinking and that kind of burial was great in the early days of the city when the population of Toronto was in the hundreds or the thousands. But over the course of the 1800s, Toronto went from looking like this in 1793 to looking like this in 1893. More than 200,000 people had moved to Toronto by the time the 1800s were over. And I'm sure you will be shocked to hear that every single one of them eventually died. And they had to go somewhere, all those dead people. So the small local cemeteries, like this one, which was in Scarborough, ended up looking like this eventually. They filled up. And those problems of overcrowding that, as Nicole spoke to, is a major concern today, was becoming a major concern by the middle of the 1800s. It meant that we had nowhere to put the dead, that burials were getting rushed and made shallow, so you were just one heavy rain or a curious dog away from coming face to face with the decomposing corpse of your own grandmother. And was an even bigger problem when there was mass death, which happened in Toronto more than once. So in the cholera epidemics of the 1830s, people were dying by the thousands and fast in a matter of hours. So mass graves were dug right in the middle of the city. There was one built right next to St. James Cathedral. They say that there might be as many as 6,000 people buried under St. James Park today, and that it was a rushed, shallow burial. So there are rumors that if you go there after a big storm, you might find a piece of human bone that has come to the surface. And that wasn't just really creepy, it was also a big public health concern. So the answer was the Cemetery Beautiful movement. And cemeteries like Mount Pleasant, and like this, the Necropolis and St. James in Cabbagetown, were the new wave. Cemeteries got big, and they were planned outside the city in what now is the heart of the city in Cabbagetown, but then was outside the city center. That meant that you could go visit your relatives on occasion, but they weren't right there next to you on a daily basis. It also meant that the city had some new green space, and in the days before public parks were a really big deal, it meant that cemeteries were very popular destinations. So people would enjoy them, like these folks, because who wouldn't enjoy a relaxing picnic surrounded by death? And it meant, too, that cemeteries, in the days before museums were a big deal for the public, that these cemeteries became places where you could connect with the city's history. And that's still true to this day. So to take the Necropolis as an example, it's somewhere where you can very easily connect with the story of one of the most infamous events in Canadian history, the Rebellion of 1837, because this is where Toronto's notorious rebel mayor, William Lloyd Mackenzie, is buried. And it is a way to have a really visceral, even emotional connection to those long ago events when you're literally standing above the bones of the people who were involved in them. Mackenzie, of course, is the rebel mayor who led the army down Yonge Street and tried to overthrow British rule in Toronto and replace it with a democratic Canadian republic, which was also a bit of a drunken mess, but a very serious thing and a real attempt to overthrow the government. People died on both sides. And you can find people from both sides in the necropolis. It's not just Mackenzie. You can find some of the people who fought against him, too. So this is the grave of the Abbott family. Wilson Ruffin Abbott was the father of the family. He's the next slide. He was born in the southern United States. He fell in love with his wife, Ellen Toyer, on the banks of the Mississippi. But they were forced to flee the southern US in the face of racist violence when their general store was burned to the ground by a mob. They first moved to New York and eventually across the border, where they settled in Toronto and spent the rest of their lives trying to make the city a more welcoming refuge for people who were escaping slavery on the Underground Railroad. He also got involved in local politics and volunteered for the local militia, which is why he was there that day when the government marched army back up Yonge Street, the other direction, to crush Mackenzie's army. His son, Anderson Ruffin Abbott, followed in the family's active footsteps. He was the first Black Canadian ever to graduate from medical school. He went to Trinity College, which stood where Trinity Bellwoods Park is today. And when the American Civil War broke out, he volunteered for the Union Army as a surgeon and ended up being put in charge of a hospital inside a refugee camp in Washington, D.C., where he tended to people fleeing slavery and soldiers who were returning wounded from the front lines. There are also other rebels buried in the necropolis. This is Elizabeth Lount. Her husband is one of them. Some of the rebels at the end of the rebellion managed to flee to safety in the United States. Some were captured and sent into exile in Australia, and 2 were captured and tried and found guilty enough to be sentenced to death. This is Elizabeth Lount presenting a petition signed by thousands of Upper Canadians begging for her husband's life, asking the Chief Justice for mercy, which he refused. So both Lount and Matthews were hanged just off King Street East. The government was worried that they would become martyrs to the cause and that any kind of public funeral could end up being a flashpoint for further violence and a rallying cry for Democrats. So they refused to let the families bury the men and instead had a quiet burial in the Potter's Field, which was the non-denominational cemetery that Nicole mentioned, and also where paupers were buried. It was actually just a few blocks from here, right at the corner of Yonge and Bloor. And they were giving a very subtle gravestone, flat, says very little, just their names and the date, so it wouldn't draw any attention. Although, in the end, that's not exactly how it went. Over time, as Yorkville grew as its own village, people who lived here were sick of having to share their space with the dead and presented a petition to have the dead of Yorkville evicted. Potter's Field was closed down. All of the people who were buried there were dug back up and moved to other cemeteries, many of them to the necropolis. So that's where you'll find Lount and Matthews today, buried in the necropolis under that same subtle gravestone. Although 6 decades later, this giant 15-foot column was added to their memory by people who supported their cause, and a century after that, it got an official government plaque, so that now the forgotten grave of Lount and Matthews is actually one of the most easily recognizable graves in the entire necropolis. And they're not the only dead of Toronto who ended up being moved long after their deaths. So the next grave is this one. This is the Baldwin family tomb, which is home to one of the strangest and grisliest burials in Toronto's history. The Baldwins were one of the most powerful families in the early history of Toronto, one of the founding families, and they are the ones who built the original Spadina house. And this was the tomb just outside their home on their own grounds in the hill above Davenport. There are a few very important people buried inside. The first one is Peter Russell, who is one of the biggest jerks in the entire history of Toronto. He was a corrupt gambling addict who was, of course, put in charge of the city's finances in its very early days. The receiver general, who townspeople would say was an appropriate title because he was generally receiving money, and gave himself so much land that when he died and the cure of crushed deer antler in red wine for some reason did not work and save his life, he had to die in Toronto because even though he wanted to leave, he had given himself so much free land he couldn't find anyone to buy it, so he could go home and die in England. He was family friends with the Baldwins, especially William Warren Baldwin, who was an architect, the guy who designed the original bits of Osgoode Hall and Spadina House itself. In fact, he's the guy who built Spadina as a road because he wanted to have a clear view all the way from his window down to the lake, so he just carved a road out of the forest. He was also a big supporter of democracy and passed that along to his son, Robert, who is one of the most, he's the next slide, and he's one of the most important politicians in Canadian history. Many of you will already know him. He and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine from Montreal teamed up to bring responsible government to Canada, the first real democracy that we had. But he also suffered from terrible depression, especially after the death of his wife, Eliza. He suffered horrible headaches, had nightmares that kept him up at night, so that sometimes he would nod off in Parliament. He was known to burst into tears in public. He was said to have a funereal bearing. He carried his love letters that he'd gotten from Eliza in the coat pocket he wore all the time. And on the anniversary of her death and of their wedding, he could be found wandering the streets of Toronto alone, visiting all the landmarks of their relationship, from their old house on Front Street, making his slow way up to Spadina House to be where he could visit her tomb and her room, which he had kept as a shrine. By the end, he was longing for death and a chance to join her, which he did not long after bringing responsible government in. In a few weeks after he was laid to rest in the family tomb, his family discovered a note in his jacket pocket, which listed all of his last requests. Many of them were entirely normal. He wanted to be buried with the love letters he'd gotten from his wife that he'd carried with him always, and the brooch she'd given him as a gift. But some of them were a little weirder. He wanted, for instance, his coffin to be chained together with Eliza's coffin so that they would be connected through eternity. And he also wanted his corpse to be given the same cesarean section wound that had killed her from childbirth. And he was very clear in his letter. He said that even if they didn't find this note until after he'd been laid to rest, they needed to go get him and do it anyway. So about a month after Robert Baldwin was buried, his family went into the family tomb with a doctor and cracked his coffin open and split the stomach of his corpse just the way Eliza's had been, before closing it and chaining them back together, this time for good. But eventually, the tomb was moved, so now it stands in St. James Cemetery, which is just next to the necropolis, where you can stand there above the grave of one of the most important politicians in Canadian history, chained to the bones of the woman he loved. And in the time since he moved there, things have changed. St. James was once outside the city, in a quiet spot overlooking the Don Valley. Today, it's on a loud spot overlooking the Don Valley, with a highway roaring below and subways clattering by on the viaduct, and the towers of St. Jamestown winking on in the distance at dusk. And that was true for many of the garden cemeteries. Toronto grew, and most of them are now in what we would consider the city center, those original ones. Some, like the settler graveyard of Richview Cemetery, is in the middle of a highway interchange in Etobicoke. St. Michael's Cemetery has disappeared behind condo towers and office towers at Yonge and St. Clair. You can only get to it through a hidden alleyway. And a funny thing happened as the city grew and swallowed these garden cemeteries up, and that's that that they became actually less popular. So once it was a popular destination for recreation and those morbid picnics, now there were public parks, much more than there used to be. So you could enjoy a picnic without being faced with the inevitability of your own mortality. And now there were museums too. So they became a way to connect with history that didn't involve walking among the dead. And that sort of changed our relationship to death, especially at a time when mortality rates were dropping too, and religion has become less popular than it once was. So the dead ended up being in these parallel, separate cities. And that's quite literally what necropolis means. It means city of the dead. And it really is a city. There's 64,000 people buried in the necropolis, which is more than people are alive in Fredericton. And they're kept away from our daily lives, sequestered in those forbidden taboo cities, kept frequently behind wrought iron gates and behind gates like this gorgeous one at the necropolis, which feels like a portal into another world. But the dead aren't just on one side of a fence. They're around us all the time. And if you're walking through the city today, you can encounter their stories and the stories of the way they died around you all the time. Many of them still kept in the built heritage that surrounds us. So, for instance, this shouldn't be the next slide. Slide 28, did they just cut off? This ordinary looking hill in Scarborough is not an ordinary looking, or it's not an ordinary hill at all. It's near the corner of Lawrence and Bellamy Road. It's actually a 700-year-old Wendat burial mound. It contains the remains of hundreds of people who were buried during the 1300s as part of a ceremony called the Feast of the Dead by the missionaries who arrived hundreds of years later and witnessed later versions of that same ceremony, where people who had died during the life of a village were taken out of their temporary bark coffins and reburied together in a communal grave, bones mixed together, sometimes including people from other communities, as a sign, that intermingling of their souls through an eternity of the closeness between communities. It was discovered in the 1950s when a new subdivision, the neighborhood of Bendale, was being put in, and a digger tore through the hill and uncovered the remains. And today, it's preserved as a public but sacred space. It looks like a park, but is in fact a cemetery, and serves as a reminder of the people who were here hundreds of years before the first European ever set foot on the place where Toronto is today. Some of the places are also from the settler era. So hidden among the trees on the island, you'll find this, which is the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse. It is the second oldest lighthouse in Canada, and in fact, no less of an authority than Lighthouse Digest, which is a real magazine, I'm not making that up, says that the oldest lighthouse on the East Coast has been renovated so many times that this should really count as the oldest. And it is the oldest building in Toronto that still stands on the spot where it was originally constructed. It's also the scene of one of our most grisly murders. In the War of 1812, the first lightkeeper was killed by some soldiers from Fort York. The versions of the story differ one from another, but some accounts have him being chopped to pieces by them and buried in the sand. And it's brought to life one of Toronto's oldest ghost stories, that on some nights you can see the ghost of J.P. Rattlemuller, that first lightkeeper, wandering through the mists on the island, missing his arms. And some nights, they say, you can see his blood staining the steps inside the lighthouse. And it's also, I think, the only place in Toronto where the plaque on the side of the lighthouse mentions the ghost story as part of the official history of the building, which was a big controversy at the time. The people putting up the plaque wanted to include it, and city and metro council weren't so sure. Fred Gardner, the metro chairman, said it would only scare people, and another city councilor said, I can't see that it would make the place attractive to children, having clearly never met a child in his life. You can also find this tomb if you're taking a stroll through High Park. This is the Howard's tomb. John Howard was another architect and a painter. He and his wife Jemima lived in Colburn Lodge. He's the guy who gave the city High Park. And his wife fell fatally ill with breast cancer, I believe. He started building this enormous tomb. And it is big. It weighs 10 tons with huge stones and a huge cross on top of it, and was meant to protect their remains from the grave robbers that plagued Toronto in the Victorian era. He also put it behind that fence you can see, which comes all the way from London, from St. Paul's Cathedral, which was built by Christopher Wren, and he also designed the fence, which you can see a detail of here. And when the church was being renovated around the time that John Howard's wife got ill, he decided to save the fence from destruction and shipped it across the ocean, and even rescued it from the bottom of the St. Lawrence River after the ship carrying it sank, to put it now in High Park, where it stands, still guarding the grave from grave robbers to this day. A lot of the deathly tales of Toronto are tied to just ordinary looking houses too, ones that don't even have a plaque. So this spooky house is on Euclid Avenue, just a few steps north of Queen. And it was here in 1919 that a medium by the name of Louis Benjamin claimed that he could speak with the dead. He used a Ouija board and seances to contact spirits that he said were speaking from a place they called the 20th plane, which was bathed in pink light and astral flower perfume, where they ate meals of synthetic chemicals and liquid rice and could travel with the power of thought. They also, coincidentally, and I'm sure not suspiciously at all happened to be mostly the most famous people in history, everyone from Lincoln to Jesus Christ, which I suspect also helped book sales of The 20th Plane, written by his mentor, Dr. Watson, no relation to Sherlock's, who claimed the spirits had also said that he should include some of his own poetry in the book. But as a reminder, too, of what the city was like in 1919, that when the Star is filled with headlines about Benjamin and Watson and those dead spirits, the rest of the paper is filled with stories about German troops marching back out of occupied territories and Canadian troops coming home from the war, filled with timetables of when their trains will be getting back to Union Station, that it was a city deep in grief, who desperately wanted to hear the message that Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the dead poet, included in the opening of the book, that death is an illusion and life is eternal. One of the people who desperately wanted to believe that story lived in this house, which is on Riverside Drive. It overlooks the Humber Valley. It was called Journey's End by its owner, Lucy Maud Montgomery, because she thought, and correctly, that this would be the last place she ever lived. She moved to Toronto in her later years between the wars, and was there when the Second World War started, working on the final manuscript, the last sequel to Anne of Green Gables. And the day she submitted it, she was found dead in her bed beside a bottle of pills and distressing note that her family kept secret for the next 80 or some odd years, until her granddaughter wrote an article revealing the apparent suicide as an attempt to have a stronger conversation about mental health. This house, too, which doesn't have a plaque, it's 295 Vaughan Road, just a couple of blocks from where I live, is the house where Emma Goldman died. She was called by the papers the most dangerous woman in the world, the most notorious anarchist on earth at a time when anarchists were carrying out bombings and assassinations on a regular basis. She'd been kicked out of the United States, in part for her opposition to the First World War, and came to Toronto because it was the closest she could get to her own family, who lived just across the lake in Rochester. And while she was here, she was one of the most progressive people in the city pushing for change. So she was giving speeches, including one in this very room, about things like birth control before talking about birth control was legal. She spearheaded the campaign to keep Toronto teachers from being allowed to beat their own students in class, and gave talks about other social issues as well as literature, always very conscious that the laws in Toronto were fairly restrictive and that she could at any moment be called into jail by the Toronto Police Morality Squad. She was known to carry a book with her wherever she went because she knew at any moment she could be arrested and would need something to read in jail. This is her from her younger days, one of her multiple mugshots. This might have been the time she was arrested in New York, I think. She was arrested on 2 occasions in New York, once for talking about birth control, once for suggesting that starving workers should ask for bread, and if they weren't given it, take it. And she died of a stroke in that house, 2 strokes, in fact, both of them in that house, at a time when she was fighting to keep an Italian-Canadian anarchist from being sent back to Mussolini's Italy, for opposing fascists in Toronto, which the police were not fans of at the time. And some of these landmarks that are connected to death aren't actually very subtle or hidden at all. This is a tower of the TD Centre, which I'm sure many people in this room know was built by Mies van der Rohe, the architect who changed skylines around the world, turning them into steel and glass. This was Toronto's, obviously, first giant bank tower, towering like a monolith above the city, part of the huge complex that's still there today. And in the 1990s, it was the site of one of Toronto's stupidest deaths, which has been shared often, so you might know it already. There's a lawyer named Gary Hoy, who in 1993 had for years been in the habit of impressing articling students. And every year when his firm would have a party for those students, he would throw himself against the window of their office to show just how well built the TD Centre was, and that the glass was unbreakable. And it never did break. In 1993, when he pulled the stunt, the glass remained just as unbroken as ever, but the entire window popped out of its frame and sent him hurtling those 24 stories to his death. The firm ended up going downhill from there and closed just a couple of years later. So, as you can see from just those few stories that I've sort of picked as some of my favorites, the dead are all around us all the time. And this gate that feels like a portal to the city of the dead at the necropolis is really mostly just an illusion. The dead can't be so easily contained. Their stories are around us all the time. They're the ones who made Toronto what it is today. And if we want to understand ourselves and our city, then it helps to know their stories of how they lived and how they died. Their stories are our stories, and their traditions are our traditions. Their homes are even our homes. Because Toronto, like every city, is a city of the dead. Thank you.
What these talks brought to my mind is my youngest brother, who died far too young, was buried in Necropolis. And seeing the photographs of the entrance to that cemetery, that's a place that we go to visit. And we were lucky enough that his birthday is on May 27th, which is a glorious time in any cemetery. The flowers are out, the birds, the trees are just budding. And every year on his birthday, he and myself and his husband, we get together and we have a little picnic at the grave. And we pour a little champagne on the grave, because that's all Carl ever drank, was a little sip of champagne. And it started informally, just as like, what are we going to do? It's his birthday. How are we going to celebrate that? And it's grown into being this very rich annual tradition that we both really value. And it puts you in a very different relationship with your family to have these kinds of rituals. And the cemeteries are the places that can support that activity. And of course, as Nicole was saying, in certain cemeteries, the rituals around death and reverence are different in different cultures. But the cemeteries were the earliest parks. Having a kind of a positive relationship with the family who's gone before, it enriches our lives. So I don't know if that's triggering anybody else's stories or questions from the speakers, because they brought us very, very different perspectives on the city. Yes.
This question is mainly for Nicole. I'm wondering, it's probably based on a number of factors that would make this issue probably hard to tabulate, but I'm wondering whether or not there exists an optimal municipal size within North American cities to be able to do death care within cemetery spaces sustainably, and whether there exists like real great models for Toronto to follow, if there exists then within our continent, within the size that is comparable to a city like Toronto, whether or not we have goals to work towards in the United States or even Canada.
It's a very good question. Yes and no. Like, there's material out there on cemetery master planning and what that can look like for various cities. So, for example, Wellington did conduct a cemetery master plan. Feasibility studies are always good to kind of capture what the population is looking like and who lives here, right? Through census. And so I did leave materials in the back that talk about a few cemetery master plans, but with respect to Toronto, the York Region Cemetery Needs Study is the closest thing that we have that just starts the conversation with the initial plan and is looking at what are our options in terms of mortality rates, what are the cultural practices, how do we consume land, what's land consumption like with respect to cremation, burials, scattering gardens, where are people going. And we're looking at naturalized landscapes as well and how they, the different types of sustainable ways that we can use natural burial. For example, because natural burial, bodies are shrouded as opposed to being in vaults and crypts and coffins. And the landscape is much more different with regards to its maintenance. Maintenance fees are pretty much non-existent with respect to that, because you're not maintaining tombstones or mausoleums that are in disrepair. And so there's a starting conversation with regards to the cemetery master plan, but it's not really out there. Eric Lees, I've done a bit of part-time work with Lees and Associates in Vancouver. They're a cemetery planning architectural landscape firm, and they have been doing quite a bit out in Vancouver and in BC. So I've left some materials back there. So they're kind of the ones that are championing what we can do. And their municipalities are a bit more responsive to look into that, because they do have higher cremation rates. So their land consumption conversations are much more different with regards to in-ground burial. Hope that provides some more insight. But there's lots of pamphlets at the back that speak to different cities in Canada that are having the conversation.
Okay, one question at the back and then one at the front. I'll start with this one. Yeah.
This was for
I'm not actually sure. I know the Pauper Cemetery was shut down in the middle of the 1800s, and most of the bodies moved to the necropolis, which I think is probably a little early, certainly for when the ward was at its densest. Yeah, so I think the Pauper Cemetery was already shut down by then. So I'm not actually sure where a lot of the people from the ward would have ended up. There were certainly still some cemeteries active right in the heart of the city, sort of when that was starting up. And some of them just next to churches. I know just a couple of decades before that, when the Irish famine victims were dying by the hundreds and maybe even thousands downtown, they were buried, many of them sort of en masse at St. Michael's in the east, I think in unmarked sort of mass graves that are under a schoolyard now. But I'm not actually sure for the ward.
It just made me realize that in all of my research and studies, I talked about them dying and how they lived, but I realized I never even questioned where they went once they died.
Yeah.
Especially with issues of overcrowding and density of population.
No, it's not fully, but I've dealt with racialization and that type of politics in my work, so yeah.
There's a question.
Yeah, good idea. Like, this was mostly, it sort of builds off of the first question, mostly for my question is regarding the future of cemeteries and for Toronto specifically, you mentioned that there's only about 10 to 20 years of space left for people to be buried and go around here. And a couple of years ago, several members of the funeral industry and the cemetery industry had approached municipal government, wanting to be planning a growth committee to request the city do a cemetery needs analysis of the city to determine what they could do, what the issue was, how much space there was left, and what the role of municipal government could be. And city staff at the time said that they did not have the resources to conduct this study, and the chair of the committee said that he did not think that there was a significant role for municipal government in this field. So the item was deferred as language as a deferral to planning growth and so my question then is, what is the role for municipalities in planning for the future of death, or is this mostly a question that needs to be tackled by the industry?
Good question. Under the Municipal Act, municipalities are responsible and accountable for residents within their boundaries to be buried within the city that they live in. So the municipality is supposed to be providing cemetery space from a regulatory standpoint under that act. Under the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act, which is another formula piece of legislation, it does speak about, again, municipalities providing the need to establish, alter, and increase the capacity of existing cemeteries within its geographical boundaries. Yes, the Planning and Growth Committee does speak to it being a private issue. I was told the same thing by the chair when I went 2 years ago to give a deputation to kind of build off of what was that conversation. And the municipality feels it's a private sector issue. However, the municipality does not realize they are cemetery operators, and they do own and operate both inactive and active cemeteries here in the city of Toronto. And I wrote about that specifically in the Spacing magazine, and I listed what their cemeteries were, what their licenses were, and what denominational cemeteries they were actually operating. And so they're in the business already, so for them to not be able to provide some type of diagnostic plan and how to address the growing population rate is, I think, only because they don't understand it. It's a whole other animal, it's a whole other language to kind of wrap their head around, but yet Parks and Rec, they're cemetery operators. When you go to City Hall and you need a place, they have to give you a place. You know what I mean? And so they're doing it already, but they're thinking about it from a private sector approach, and so that's why there's a lot of pushback. At my deputation, they said people in Toronto are going to have to go up north north of the 400 to be buried because they don't even know how to have the conversation, right? And so that's what the future is looking like here. But hopefully we can, have that conversation and continue holding these spaces to really think about death as an equity issue in Toronto, which is already inaffordable.
When was the last cemetery built in Toronto?
I don't remember.
It's been that long.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time a cemetery was established here in Toronto. I know that there have been a few applications for crematoriums, but I don't recall the last time the cemetery was even built.
I noticed you had put section 37 on the screen. What was the intent when you mentioned section 37?
So just
that is a contribution from a developer for extra height and density.
yeah.
So is there any sort of tapping into a fund like that?
Yeah.
Or something like a Parkland fund, but this would be a cemetery fund where developers would contribute.
Exactly.
Which
like
may pay for their own residents' plots eventually.
To an extent, more so for like amenity space and services. So, for example, it might not be a cemetery with green space at all. It could be a memory scape or a place where we can look at how we're commemorating death. So it could be, a sundial with granite and there's names around it. And it's just about the people in the community. So I think it's important to, while we're allocating Section 37 developments for community amenities, spaces for cemeteries or death spaces or deathscapes specifically should be allocated, even if you're doing infill. Can we allocate a percentage of that for a municipal cemetery over time? So there's so many different ways to approach it, but we're already capturing those monies. So how come we're just not using asset management as an approach to solve this problem?